Hi, I'm Blake Ostler. Today is Thanksgiving Day 2020. We're in the midst of a pandemic, and it's the perfect time to be considering what I'm going to be discussing and actually reading excerpts from my book, the fourth volume of Exploring Mormon Thought, God's Plan to Heal Evil. Now, the excerpts that I'm going to be reading have to do with basically setting up the problem of evil and then looking at a particular kind of response to the problem that I think is a very common type of assessment of the problem, and that is we're just not in a position to be able to judge whether or not what occurs is actually something God should allow, so we can't really get started on the problem of evil. I reject that kind of a response, and I'm going to read and explain why I hope in what I read. Now, the first thing to consider is that we're talking about a personal deity, a God who is personal in the sense that he is conscious and aware of what happens, in fact is all-knowing and therefore all-aware. A being who is good, in fact perfectly good, and a being who is all-powerful. But that's the basis of the problem. If God is aware of everything that occurs, and God is all-powerful and therefore can have a world without any evils at all, and is all good and therefore would want a world without any evils at all, we have to ask then, why is there any evil? Because that's an inconsistent triad. And we therefore have to have some kind of an explanation for why we confront the kinds of evils and challenges that we do. I think the most common response is based upon our human limitations cognitively. It seems to me, and I'm going to begin reading on page 9 of the book. This is page 9 again of Exploring Mormon Thought, the fourth volume. Now, it seems to me that there are at least 3 observations that must be admitted with respect to God's challenge from the problem of evil. We cannot be expected to know what God's actual purposes are in allowing these particular evils, absent particular revelation. Unless he tells us, we don't know what he's actually up to. We are often not in a very good cognitive position to make decisions about all things considered judgments, and God's glory and vast knowledge are such that his possible reasons for allowing particular evils that may well be beyond our ability to grasp. So, if we cannot make all things considered judgments, such as assessing all the relevant variables of how changing an event would impact all of the interrelated concerns a divine being may have, then it's really hard to assess whether or not the kinds of evils that occur are something that ought to be allowed. Now, when I say ought to be allowed, we have to have in mind what it means to have a greater good. Now, in our world, we often impose pain upon people because of the benefits that we will achieve by doing so. Anybody who's been through surgery knows that. But consider if a child is bitten by a dog that may be rabid, we then take and submit that child to a series of very painful rabies shots that are injected directly into the stomach. It's a very painful series of shots. But because rabies can be fatal, even the pain that is necessary is justified because of the greater good that is realized, that is, saving the child's life. So the argument from evil requires us to assess whether there are plausible greater goods that are both necessary to obtain that greater good and sufficient in value to justify God's allowing the kinds of evils that actually occur. So keep in mind there are these 2 conditions. It has to both be of such value that it would justify allowing the evil that occurs, and it has to be necessary. If there's some less painful way to attain that good, then God would be obligated to do it in a less painful way if he's really truly good. However, assessing such greater goods requires us to assess what the effect would be of disallowing evils for such concerns as human moral development, prospects to realize the value of free will, developing truly loving relationships through circumstances that call us to be compassionate, the effect on the natural order, what God's purposes for creation could be, and the possibility that God just may have his reasons that we can't even begin to fathom. Are we really in a cognitive position to assess such things, given all the variables at issue? The skeptical theist answer to the problem of evil suggests that we are justified by considerations such as those I've mentioned, in concluding that, and I call this ST in the book, better change the page so I can read it to you. Given our cognitive limitations, it is likely that if there were goods known to God that were necessary for a greater good, then it would be beyond our ability to either A, grasp what they are, or B, assess how it is necessary to allow these evils that actually occur in order to obtain these goods. Now, the analogy is often used that we stand in terms of cognitive capacities like a dog stands to its master. If I take my dog to a veterinarian for a vaccine or worm shot, my dog may well feel that I have delivered him up to a stranger to inflict pain on him. My dog cannot begin to fathom the science and germ theory necessary to grasp why we do such things. The analogy suggests that my dog can no more grasp why I would subject him to a shot to cure worms and vaccinate him than I can grasp God's reasons for allowing evil. There may be goods that we simply cannot begin to fathom that God could not explain to us because they are so far beyond our cognitive ability to grasp. Now, I'm going to jump to a later section of this book that has to do with the response and why I don't think that the response works. It's called the problem of moral quietude. Now, what is the problem of moral quietude? The problem of moral quietude is that if there really is a greater good for every single evil event that occurs, then we're justified in just sitting back on the couch every Sunday and watching football and eating Cheetos, because everything that occurs is not really evil, it's actually a greater good. It's actually justified by considerations as to what can be obtained from allowing it to occur. So we just sit back knowing God's in charge and not have to worry about it. Now, the believer in the omni-God cannot adopt skeptical theism, as I have outlined it, without a significant revision of our moral beliefs. It seems to me that if we really believe that the omni-God exists so that there are no unjustified evils, then we are justified in moral quietude, in believing that no matter what we do, the particular events of so-called evils that we confront are in reality justified because they are necessary to the realization of some greater good that may well be beyond our cognitive ability to grasp. If a little girl is raped and bludgeoned to death, it's all for the best, because otherwise the omni-God wouldn't have allowed it to happen. If we had stopped this event from happening, then we would have prevented a necessary condition for some good so great in value that it outweighs the disvalue of allowing a little girl to be kidnapped, beaten, and bludgeoned, and tortured, and then killed. Now that has to be a very significant good, and the link to the necessity of allowing that to occur has to be logically necessary. This response has been given to the objection for moral quietude by Daniel Howard Snyder, William P. Alston, and Michael Bergman, all very excellent philosophers of religion. They suggest that this conclusion doesn't follow because in assessing what we will do, we are limited by goods that we can grasp, whereas the supposed greater goods that God allows are beyond our grasp. Thus, we should still act to prevent events that are, by our best lights, evil. However, this response overlooks the fact that we are not limited to what is within our cognitive grasp to make moral decisions when we have an authority with much greater knowledge than we possess, whose conduct demonstrates that we should refrain from acting. Consider an example. A nurse intern has been working with a team of doctors who are very competent and appear to him to be very morally upright persons. He is tending a patient who goes into convulsions that threaten the patient's life. The hospital where he works has a drug that he has learned in nursing school would certainly stop the convulsions. However, he noticed that when this particular patient went into convulsions on prior occasions, the other doctors did not administer the drug. Even though they have given the drug to other patients in the hospital when they have had convulsions. The nurse has no idea why they haven't administered the drug in the past to this particular patient. The nurse cannot reach the other physicians and must act immediately. It certainly seems that the nurse has good moral reason not to administer the drug to the patient, even though he has no idea why the drug was not given to this patient when it has been given to others under similar circumstances in the past. Now, consider an analogous situation. Sue is a doctor who knows of numerous cases of suffering from prostate cancer. She knows that millions of people have suffered horribly from prostate cancer. Sue has become a believer in the omni-God and believes that she is rationally justified in her belief. She has come to believe through reflection on the problem of evil that the Omni-God must have reasons that she cannot begin to grasp to allow prostate cancer to ravage millions. She trusts that the Omni-God is perfectly good and would not allow such cancers if they were not necessary to realize some greater good. She knows that prior to the cure being developed, some people have had the cancer treated and have successfully prolonged their lives while others have not. She has no explanation for why some respond to the treatments and others do not. But she trusts that the Omni-God has reasons. Now suppose that a drug is developed that cures prostate cancer and is made available to Sue. Sue is confronted with the issue as to whether she will administer the new drug. It seems that Sue is in a morally relevant situation to the nurse intern, and thus would be morally justified in deciding that if she doesn't administer the drug, it is just as well. Because if the Omni-God in fact allows her to administer it, she knows that he must have his reasons not to cure cancer himself. He must have had reasons to allow the treatment to be successful with some and not with others. Either way, if she does nothing, it must all be for the best, because otherwise the Omni-God wouldn't allow it. Further, she believes that the Omni-God knows more than any physician about curing cancer. She also knows that the Omni-God hasn't cured cancer before now. She concludes that the Omni-God must have had a very good reason to allow the kinds of suffering she has seen of those who experience prostate cancer. She also concludes that the evil of prostate cancer is necessary to the realization of whatever very great good the Omni-God had in mind. Thus, she concludes that administering the drug will prevent the greater good to which prostate cancer is a necessary condition. Because the Omni-God allows prostate cancer to realize this greater good, whatever it may be that she can't fathom, she concludes that she must not administer the drug because the Omni-God is in a much better position than she is to assess the moral rectitude and interrelated considerations of preventing prostate cancer than she is. She can conclude that whatever occurs, it's all for the best. Now, this thought experiment suggests that the problem of moral quietude is a real problem for the skeptic who claims that God must have sufficient reason that we cannot grasp to allow the particular evils that actually occur as a necessary condition to some greater good. The person who believes that every instance of evil is necessary to the realization of some greater good also must believe that if the Omni-God has allowed these kinds of evils in the past, then it is either not really evil or it is justified because it makes a greater good possible. Thus, there is no moral motivation to prevent any events that we take to be horrendous and radical evils, even if it appears to us that, for all we can fathom, these events should be prevented. Belief in the Omni-God tells for us that our judgments cannot be trusted, and what appears to us to be unjustified evil cannot truly be so. Thus, it seems to me that this stance is fundamentally at odds with the injunction of the gospel to feed the poor, care for the widows, and avoid evil. If we fail to do so, it must be all for the best, if the morally skeptical stance is adopted to defeat the argument from evil. Moreover, such moral skepticism places everything we think we know about what is right and wrong in question. We cannot assess what it is for the best. It is just beyond our grasp. How could we make moral judgments given such moral global skepticism? Equally important, religious faith seeks to praise God for his moral goodness and beneficence. Yet if God's goodness is radically different than human goodness, then we have no basis in our experience for calling it goodness at all. And we have even less basis for praising and glorifying God as human faith is wont to do. A child who is totally ignorant of her parents' values has no reason to admire them and no ability to emulate them. If everything that the child knows as good is different from how her parents treat her, and her parents insist that they are good in treating her for her best interest by starving and beating her, then the child must be mystified as to what the word good could possibly mean to her parents. If the Omni-God is good no matter what happens to us, then the terms right and wrong, good and evil, and loving and hateful lose all distinction, and thus all meaning. Now, in my book, that's a very high price to pay, and it's a price that cannot be paid by the theist, it seems to me. I go on and discuss the problem of evil much further, of course. I look at other responses. I incorporate, of course, what I think is valid about moral or ethical skepticism and our inability to grasp reality, because it's a truth. We are cognitively limited in what we are able to assess. And so that plays a part, but it can't be the entire answer, because if it is, then God could be a moral monster and it would all be just the same. In any event, happy Thanksgiving to you. I hope you've enjoyed this, and if you get no more of my book than that, at least you got that. So have a happy Thanksgiving. See you later.